I still think about that weekend sometimes, even though it has been years since it happened. It was in late October of 2019, when I was 26 and trying to prove to myself that I could handle a solo camping trip. I had taken a few short hikes before, nothing serious, but I felt like I needed a break from work and noise. I kept telling myself that a quiet weekend alone in the woods would help me clear my head. I picked a place far from the main road, deep inside Miller Ridge Forest in northern Colorado. I had read that it was peaceful and not very crowded that time of year. That part turned out to be true, a little too true. I arrived around noon after a long drive on a dusty road that slowly turned into loose gravel and then into nothing but a narrow dirt path with uneven tire ruts. My cell signal was already dropping in and out, and by the time I parked at the entrance of the trail, it was completely gone. I didn't think much of it because I planned for that. I had brought a paper map, a flashlight, extra food, batteries, a thick sleeping bag, and a small orange tent. The air was cold but dry, and the forest smelled like pine needles and frozen soil. The hike to my campsite took longer than I expected. The trail wound between tall, thin trees that made the ground feel darker than it should have been at that time of day. The silence bothered me almost instantly. I kept waiting to hear distant hikers or maybe a dog barking, but there was only the soft crunch of leaves under my boots and the faint sound of branches moving in the wind. Every time the wind stopped, everything went completely still, and I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like the whole forest was waiting for something. When I reached a small clearing beside a shallow creek, I decided that was where I would set up camp. The clearing was maybe 20 feet wide, surrounded by a thick line of trees and dead branches. The creek was barely moving, thin enough that I could walk over it, but I liked the steady sound of running water. It made me feel less alone. I pitched my tent slowly, making sure the stakes were firm in the cold ground, and set out my sleeping bag and small gas stove. I ate a simple meal, then spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area close to the clearing. I walked uphill through dead grass and stepped over fallen logs. I noticed several long scratches on one of the trees, uneven and fresh. I assumed it was from an animal, maybe a deer rubbing its antlers or something like that, so I kept walking. A little higher up the hill, I found a second set of marks, this time on a different tree, much deeper and more deliberate. They were longer than the first ones, almost running the full length of the trunk. The bark around them was scattered on the ground, and the wood underneath looked pale. I felt something tighten in my stomach. These marks didn't look like something a deer would make. They looked like something strong had dragged something sharp downward in one slow motion. I told myself not to overthink it. The forest was full of animals I didn't know much about. I turned around and walked back toward my campsite, trying not to look over my shoulder even though I felt a heavy need to. The sun went down faster than I expected. The temperature dropped so quickly that my breath came out in a thick fog. I sat inside my tent with a small lantern beside me and tried to read a book, but I could not focus. Every few minutes I heard small noises outside. Cracking branches, leaves shifting, something faint brushing through the undergrowth. I tried to tell myself it was normal that animals moved around at night, especially when the temperature changed. But the sounds felt too steady, too slow, like something circling rather than passing through. At some point in the night, I heard a deep thud, not far from the tent. It felt like something heavy landing on the ground. Then another thud, closer. The creek kept making its quiet running sound, but everything else was silent except for those slow, heavy steps. My chest tightened as I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath. I could feel my heartbeat filling my ears. The steps stopped right outside my tent. Something large was breathing there, slow and damp, like the air was being pushed through a blocked nose. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes. My lantern was still on, casting a warm glow across the tent walls, and I knew that from the outside the whole tent would look like a soft yellow shape in the darkness. I imagined how visible I must have been. A small human outline, a trapped one. I didn't move until the breathing faded and the steps shifted away. When I finally exhaled, my throat was dry. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting with my back against my backpack, hugging my knees close. Every now and then I heard faint movement in the trees. I never saw anything through the tent fabric, but that somehow made it worse. My mind filled the darkness with shapes I didn't want to imagine. When the sky finally started to brighten, I hurried out of the tent and looked around the clearing. The ground was disturbed near the edge where the trees started, as if something heavy had stood there for a while. I followed the disturbed patches with my eyes and saw a long trail of deep impressions leading back into the woods, spaced out too far apart to be a small animal. I didn't want to examine them any closer. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so much that I dropped the tent poles twice. I didn't eat, didn't rest, didn't take one last look at the quiet creek. I just left. The trail back to my car felt much longer than it had the day before. Every sound made me jump. Several times I thought I heard something moving behind me, but I refused to stop. When I finally reached the parking area, my car was the only one there. I got inside, locked the doors, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. The farther I got from the forest, the more my body loosened, like I had been clenched the entire night. I still don't know what was out there. I don't claim it was anything supernatural or strange. Colorado has its fair share of large wildlife, bears, moose, even big cats. Maybe it was one of those. Maybe I set up camp too close to its path or too close to something it had marked. All I know is that I felt watched, followed, and studied in a way I had never felt before. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike sometimes, but only on busy trails, always during the day, always making noise so animals know I'm coming. That night in Miller Ridge taught me something I didn't want to learn but probably needed to. The forest is quiet for a reason. When you step into it alone, you are only a visitor, and you don't get to decide what else is there with you. And whatever walked circles around my tent that night made it very clear that I was not the one in control. I had not gone camping alone in years, but in late September of 2021, I felt this strange urge to get away from everything. I was 27 then, living in a small rented apartment in Montana, working long shifts that made every day feel the same. I kept telling myself I needed one quiet weekend with no phone, no people, and no noise except wind and trees. That was all I wanted. No thrill, no challenge, just space to breathe. When I found a small lakeside area in the northern part of the state, far away from towns and barely listed on any trail websites, I decided that was where I'd go. The drive took almost 4 hours. Half of it was smooth highway, but the last hour was slow, narrow dirt road where my tires kicked up dust thick enough that I had to lower speed until it felt like crawling. There were no cabins, no parked cars, no signs of people. It felt strange, but also perfect. When I finally reached the small pull-off area, the air smelled like pine mixed with cold water, the kind of smell that always made me think of childhood trips. I stepped out and stretched, then stood still and just listened. Nothing but the distant rustle of trees. No engines, no talking, no planes overhead. I felt calm. The trail down to the lake wasn't long, maybe 15 minutes of walking, but it was wild and unmarked. Fallen branches snapped under my boots, and I had to push away groups of tall grass. When I reached the bottom, the lake opened in front of me like a flat sheet of dark glass. The air was colder near the water, and every small ripple looked like it was spreading across black stone. I picked a spot near a cluster of old birch trees and started setting up my tent. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering dry wood, checking my small map, and exploring a bit around the lakeshore. The ground was soft from the previous week's rain, and my boots left deep prints. While walking along the edge of the trees, I saw what looked like old tire marks near the far side of the lake, half covered by mud and leaves. They looked a few weeks old. I didn't think much about them at the time. People sometimes came here during fishing season, so tire tracks were normal. Still, something about seeing them alone in a place so empty made me feel watched for a moment. I shook it off. By sunset, I had a small fire going. I ate canned food, drank cold water straight from my jug, and sat on a flat rock. The sky turned orange, then pink, and finally faded into a deep blue. The lake looked completely black now. I felt proud in a small way, like I had earned the quiet around me. It was only when the temperature dropped sharply that I started to feel uneasy. The cold made the woods louder, Every shift of the branches, every creak, every snap stood out. I kept telling myself that forests always grow louder at night, especially cold nights. Still, the noise made the air feel tight. I put out the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it closed. Inside, I lay on my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling. The ground was hard, even with the light pad I had brought. I listened to the wind push through the birch trees and waited for sleep. I wasn't scared yet, just wide awake. But sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. Not animal steps, not soft or quick or nervous. These were slow, heavy steps on wet soil, one after another, the kind of steps made by someone wearing boots. The sound was faint at first, but I froze instantly. My breathing stopped without me trying to stop it. The steps came from the direction of the trees behind my tent, not the lake. I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe an elk, but the steps didn't match. They were too even, too measured, and they stopped right behind my tent. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I lay there in complete darkness, listening so hard that my ears hurt. For almost a full minute, nothing happened. No breathing, no movement, only the silence that felt thick enough to press against me. Then the steps started again, but moving slowly around the side of the tent, almost like someone was circling it. I grabbed the small camping knife I kept near my pack, though I knew it wouldn't do much. My mind started racing with thoughts I didn't want. Someone could have followed me from the road, or they could have been camping nearby without me noticing, or they could have been living out here for who knows how long. Each thought felt worse than the last. I kept completely still. After circling halfway around the tent, the steps stopped again. I didn't know where the person was standing now, but I felt the air shift like someone was close. I didn't hear breathing, but I felt presence. A heavy, quiet presence. Then, after what felt like forever, I finally heard the steps again, this time moving away into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife so tightly that my hand hurt. I didn't even unzip the tent. The cold inside grew worse, but fear made my body warm and shaky. Every few minutes, I heard branches break far off in the woods, but I couldn't tell if it was the wind or the same person walking slowly somewhere out of sight. When the sky finally turned pale and the sun began to rise, I crawled out of the tent. My legs were stiff and my shoulders ached. The air was icy, but the light made me feel safer. I looked around carefully. That was when I saw new footprints in the mud behind my tent. Boot prints, large ones, fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by time or weather. They led from the trees to the side of my tent and then back into the woods. They were not mine. I packed everything fast, faster than I ever had. I didn't eat, didn't wash, didn't even check half of my gear. I threw things into my pack in uneven layers. My hands shook while taking down the tent. I kept looking toward the woods, expecting someone to step out at any moment. They never did. When I started the hike back to my car, every noise made me jump. The woods looked different in the morning light, less peaceful, more exposed. When I reached the car, I unlocked it, shoved my pack inside, and drove away so fast that my tires spit rocks behind me. I didn't look back at the trailhead. For the first 2 hours of the drive home, I felt like someone might be following me. I kept checking the mirror, scanning every car behind me. Nothing ever matched the fear I felt in that tent, but the feeling stayed with me like a shadow. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't want to explain it, and I didn't want anyone to think it was in my head. I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw in the mud. Someone had walked around my tent in the middle of the night, slowly, quietly, watching me without saying a word. I have not gone camping alone again since that night. I still love the outdoors. I still love the idea of quiet mornings and cold lakes, but the thought of being out there alone makes my stomach tighten. Whenever I think back to that dark moment, me lying still, the steps circling, I feel the same pressure in my chest. The scariest part wasn't the footsteps. It was the thought that whoever it was never tried to talk, never tried to scare me, never made a sound other than walking. It was the silence, the purpose, the unknown intention. That is what keeps me from going back out there alone. Not knowing who that person was, not knowing why they stood so close to my tent, and not knowing how long they watched me before I woke up. I never liked camping alone, but that summer in 2019 I felt tired of city noise and wanted some silence. I chose a forested area in northern Montana, a place I had only visited once as a teenager. I remembered it as a quiet place with tall pines, cold air, and long empty trails that barely anyone used. Back then it felt peaceful. Now, at 26, I thought it would help me clear my head. I packed light, just a small tent, sleeping bag, basic food, a metal water bottle, a flashlight, a small camping stove, and a cheap folding knife that was more of a tool than a weapon. I left early in the morning and reached the trailhead around noon. The air was dry and warm when I started walking. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, and the deeper I went into the forest, the cooler the ground felt under my boots. I hiked for almost 2 hours before choosing a flat spot near a narrow stream. The stream made a soft running sound that felt calming. There were no other tents, no cars parked nearby, no human noises at all. I set up my tent facing the water so I could hear it through the night. After building a small fire, I cooked a simple meal, just rice and canned vegetables. I ate slowly while the forest shadows stretched longer as the sun dropped behind the trees. I watched insects fly close to the fire and vanish again into the dark. I had no cell service, but I didn't care. I thought the isolation was exactly what I needed. As night fully settled, I crawled into my tent, zipped it, and lay on my back listening to the stream. I tried focusing on the sound, but the forest was louder than I remembered. There were rustles in the bushes, cracking twigs, and distant thumps that sounded too heavy to be from small animals. I told myself it was probably deer or maybe elk. I shifted around on my sleeping bag until I felt comfortable and eventually fell asleep. I woke up sometime after midnight because something snapped loudly in the woods, sharp enough to make my heart pound as if someone had slammed a door. I stayed still for almost a full minute before sitting up. My tent was dark except for a small patch of moonlight. I listened carefully. The forest had gone strangely quiet, so quiet that even the stream sounded distant. I felt more awake than I wanted to be. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps. They were soft at first but grew louder. They didn't sound like hooves or the light taps of a small animal. They sounded wide and uneven, like someone walking with heavy boots but not lifting their feet properly. The steps stopped somewhere behind my tent. I held my breath and didn't move. I could hear my heartbeat push against my ribs. The footsteps started again, circling the tent. I could hear leaves shifting under the weight. At one point, the steps got so close that I saw the faint shadow of a leg through the thin tent fabric. The shape didn't look like animal legs. It looked like a person standing just a few feet away. My hands felt numb. I stayed completely still, hoping whoever or whatever was out there would leave. Then the footsteps stopped again. This time, they stopped right at the rear corner of my tent. I didn't hear breathing, but the silence felt full, like someone was standing perfectly still and watching the tent. I slowly reached for my flashlight, but I didn't dare turn it on. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, though it might have been less. The cold night air seeped through the tent walls, but I barely noticed because my body felt hot with adrenaline. When the footsteps finally moved away, they faded little by little, until I heard nothing except the stream again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat up with my back against my backpack, holding the flashlight and listening to every sound the forest made. When morning came, the relief I felt was strong enough that I almost laughed. I stepped out of the tent carefully. The ground around the tent was disturbed. The leaves were pressed down in a wide path that clearly showed someone had walked around my campsite several times. The footprints weren't sharp enough to show shoe details, but they were the size of adult human feet. I scanned the trees for any sign of someone, but the forest looked normal. Bright sunlight made the night feel far away, but the feeling in my stomach didn't fade. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed as quickly as possible. Before leaving, I walked a few steps into the trees behind the tent, where the footsteps had been the closest. That's when I found something that made my skin crawl. A tree trunk had fresh marks on it, thin scratches about chest level. They weren't claw marks, They were straight, uneven lines like someone had dragged a knife blade across the bark several times. The cuts looked rushed, messy, not like anything an animal would make. I didn't bother looking for more signs. I just slung my backpack over my shoulder and got moving. My walk back felt different than the hike in. Every sound made me tense. Several times I turned around because I felt like someone was behind me, but I never saw anything. The trees looked taller and darker than they had the day before. Even the stream along the trail sounded harsher, like it was rushing faster. About halfway back to the trailhead, I noticed another set of footprints along the edge of the trail. They looked similar to the ones around my tent, human-shaped, adult-sized, pressed deep into the dirt. They weren't part of the original trail markings. They looked fresh. They were headed in the same direction as me, but on the side, as if someone had been walking parallel to the trail through the trees. I didn't stop to study them. I kept moving until I finally saw the parking area through the trees. My car looked untouched, and seeing it gave me a wave of relief so strong I felt shaky. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. Only when I drove out of the forest did I feel like I was actually leaving whatever had been walking around my tent. When I got home, I thought I would calm down after a day or two, but the feeling stayed with me. I wasn't afraid of ghosts or anything supernatural. What scared me was how real everything felt. The footsteps were heavy and clear. The shadow near the tent was unmistakably human-shaped. The knife marks on the tree bark were fresh. Someone had been there in the forest that night, walking around my tent while I was alone in the dark, and I had no idea who they were or what they wanted. I never went camping alone again. Even now, years later, when I think about the forest, I don't imagine animals or peaceful quiet. I only imagine those slow, dragging footsteps circling the tent and the cold, heavy silence of someone standing outside in the dark, waiting, for reasons I will never know. I had always liked camping alone, but that summer I pushed myself a little too far. I was 27 then, tired of city noise and tired of people, so I drove out to a remote valley in northern Idaho. It was late July of 2019, and the weather had been dry for weeks. The sky looked clear when I left the highway and followed a narrow dirt road deep into the forest. I kept going until I reached a small clearing that had no signs, no trail markers, nothing man-made at all. It was exactly the kind of place I had wanted. I unpacked my small tent, stove, and the rest of my gear. The air smelled like pine sap and dust. The trees stood so close together that the sunlight came through in thin strips. I liked that. It made the whole place feel untouched. I set up camp near a fallen log and made sure I had my food hung high on a branch about 20 yards away. Just like every guidebook said. Everything felt calm. I even remember thinking the silence felt deeper than usual, like the forest was resting. Late that afternoon, I walked toward a ridge about half a mile away just to stretch my legs and look around. The ground felt dry under my boots, and every step kicked up a little bit of dirt. When I reached the ridge, I could see nothing but trees and untouched land in every direction. No smoke from other campers, no cabins, no trails. It was perfect for someone who wanted to disappear for a while. But on the way back, I found something strange. About 200 feet from my tent, the soil had been disturbed. At first I thought it was just an animal digging for roots or insects, but the marks didn't look like any animal digging. They were long, shallow scrapes, running parallel to each other across the dirt, almost like someone had dragged something heavy. The lines were fresh too. The dirt was still loose. I crouched down and touched one of the ridges, and it collapsed easily under my finger. I remember this small wave of discomfort, but I tried to ignore it. The forest always has weird marks. Wind, animals, old roots, there's always some explanation. When evening came, I sat by my small fire, ate my meal, and watched the sky turn from orange to deep blue. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun went down. The trees lost their warm glow and turned into dark shapes around me. Eventually, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. I zipped the flap and lay on top of my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside. At first, I heard the usual things: crickets, leaves shaking, maybe a bird settling in for the night. But after a while, everything went still. felt like the whole forest held its breath. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. I lay still, staring into the darkness of my tent, trying to figure out what had broken my sleep. Then I heard it again. Slow, steady footsteps on dry ground. They weren't close, but they weren't far either. They came from somewhere left of my tent, moving with a strange kind of patience, as if whoever or whatever was out there wasn't in a hurry at all. My first thought was a deer, maybe even an elk, but the steps were too controlled, too evenly spaced. Deer move lighter. These steps press down hard enough to crunch twigs and small stones. I lay there, barely breathing, listening as the sound faded into the distance. When it finally disappeared, I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling of the tent and trying not to imagine shapes moving between the trees. In the morning, I felt tired but tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the weight of the night had just made normal things feel strange. But when I stepped out of my tent, the ground told a different story. About 30 feet from where I slept, I found more disturbed soil, fresh tracks, long, dragging marks like the ones I'd seen the day before. Except these were closer, and there were deeper footprints mixed in. They looked human, barefoot. The heel prints were faint, but the toe marks dug deeper. The dirt inside them was still soft, still darker than the rest of the ground, like it had been pressed only hours earlier. My stomach tightened. I scanned the trees, trying to see if anyone was out there, but the forest looked empty. I tried to calm myself and think logically. Maybe someone was hiking through and didn't want to be seen. Maybe they were looking for a place to set up their own camp. But I kept asking myself why someone would be walking barefoot in the middle of a forest full of sharp rocks and dry branches. I considered packing up right then, but I didn't want to act out of fear. I told myself I would stay one more night and leave in the morning. I spent the day close to camp, gathering water from a small stream and checking my gear. I kept scanning the forest every few minutes without even meaning to. Each time the wind pushed through the branches, I felt myself stiffen. The place didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt watched. Around sunset, I did a full circle around my camp again, and that's when I noticed something even stranger. The branch where I had hung my food bag was empty. The rope was still tied, but the bag itself was gone. The knot had been undone cleanly. No claw marks, no tearing. It looked like someone had simply unwrapped it and taken the whole thing. My skin went cold. Animals don't untie knots. I didn't make a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat inside my tent with everything packed except the sleeping bag underneath me. The forest grew darker and darker. My heart kept beating too fast, and every small sound made my muscles tense. I kept telling myself morning would come soon, and I could leave. That was all I was waiting for, sunlight. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were closer, much closer. They moved slowly in a half circle around my tent, crushing twigs and brushing against dry grass. I felt the vibrations through the ground. My throat felt tight, and I gripped my flashlight without turning it on. I tried not to breathe too loudly. The footsteps paused for a long time right behind my tent. I could hear the faintest shift of weight, like someone leaning forward. The thin fabric between me and the night felt paper-thin. Then, without warning, the footsteps moved again, fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence. I stayed awake until the first thin line of light appeared. As soon as I could see the shape of the trees, I left my tent, stuffed it into my pack without folding it, and headed straight toward my car. The air was cold and damp, and every shadow looked like something standing still. About 50 yards from where I had camped, I found the last thing that convinced me I had made the right choice leaving. My missing food bag was lying torn open at the base of a tree, not far from the road. The knot had been undone, but the bag itself had been ripped apart after. And next to it, half buried in the dirt, was a single footprint. Barefoot, deep, bigger than my own. I didn't stop to study it. I kept walking until I reached my car, started the engine, and drove back to the highway without looking in the mirrors. To this day, I don't know who was out there with me or why they circled my camp in the middle of the night. But I do know this: whatever it wasn't lost, and it wasn't wandering by mistake. It moved with purpose. It watched my camp, took my food, stepped closer each time. And if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have woken up before it reached my tent. I never camp alone anymore. I haven't been back to that valley, and I don't plan to. Some places feel empty until you stay long enough to realize you're not the only one who likes the silence. I had planned the trip for weeks, thinking it would help me clear my head. I picked a quiet stretch of forest in northern Colorado, far from the main trails and well away from the noise of any towns. It was early autumn of 2019, and I was 28, working too many hours, sleeping too little, and hoping that a few days in the woods would settle the constant pressure I felt in my chest. I told myself the silence would help me reset, that the cold air and rough ground would remind me of something simple and real. The first day went smoothly. I parked my old sedan near a dirt road, loaded my backpack, and walked deeper into the forest than I probably should have. I wanted real isolation, not the kind you get when other hikers are 20 minutes away. The trail was uneven, covered with old pine needles and small stones. The air smelled sharp and clean, like broken branches and cold soil. My boots sank slightly in soft patches where the earth held moisture from rain the week before. Everything felt quiet in a peaceful way, the kind of silence where even your own breathing seems too loud. By late afternoon, I found a small flat area surrounded by tall trees with thick, dark trunks. The ground was dry, and a patch of sunlight fell through the branches, warm enough to sit in for a while. I set up my tent, built a fire ring with old stones, and gathered as much fallen wood as I could find. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the air turned colder in that sudden, sharp way that mountain air always changes. The fire crackled and made the darkness around me feel a little farther away. I ate, stretched out my tired legs, and watched the sky go black. Nothing strange happened that first night. I heard normal forest noises, twigs snapping from small animals, wind sliding through leaves, the soft shifting of my tent walls. I slept in broken stretches, waking up now and then to adjust my sleeping bag or listen to a noise I wasn't fully sure I heard. But nothing felt wrong. The second day was when it started. I woke up to a cold so deep it made my fingers stiff even inside my gloves. My breath hung in the air in a long, thin line. The fire had died sometime early in the night, leaving only faint red pieces under the ash. I stepped outside the tent to shake off the numbness and noticed something that didn't fit. A long, narrow mark in the dirt near the edge of my campsite. It wasn't a footprint, at least not any footprint I had seen in the woods before. It looked more like something had been dragged, like a branch or a heavy tool had scraped along the dirt, leaving a thin, curved line. It stretched from the trees toward the small clearing and then curved away again as if whatever made it had changed direction halfway through. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a fallen branch blown by the wind, but the line was too clean, too deliberate. I brushed it off and hiked for most of the day, exploring a ridge about a mile from the campsite. The ridge had thick brush and steep angles, and climbing it made my legs burn in a good way. From the top, I could see across the scattered trees and rock formations stretching away in every direction. No houses, no roads, no signs of anyone. It gave me a strange feeling, like standing in a place the rest of the world had forgotten. When I got back to camp, the sun was low, the sky tinted orange. The instant I stepped into the clearing, I felt the kind of unease that drops into your stomach all at once. My backpack, which I had left closed beside the tent, was unzipped. The flap hung open, the zipper pulled all the way down. Nothing was taken, but everything inside looked slightly shifted, like someone had pushed items aside while searching for something specific. My food bag was still sealed. My flashlight was still in its place. But the fact that anything had been touched at all made the skin on my arms tighten. I checked for animal prints, but the ground was disturbed only where I had walked earlier. No paw marks, no scuffs, no sign of anything big enough to open a zipper. I felt a dull, slow fear settle into my chest, but I kept myself moving, forcing my hands to gather more wood, forcing my feet to walk around the perimeter of camp to see if anything else was disturbed. Everything looked normal except the bag. That night, I kept the fire burning longer, letting the flames push the shadows back as far as they could. The woods around me seemed too still, like everything had frozen in place. I tried to eat, but my stomach felt tight. I lay down inside the tent long after midnight, leaving the fire to burn down on its own. I kept imagining the zipper pulling down slowly, imagining a hand or something else reaching into my things. I told myself I was overreacting, that exhaustion was making me jumpy. I woke to the sound of movement, not the quick, careless steps of an animal. This was slower, too slow, something shifting weight on the ground. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it shook the thin fabric of the tent. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The sound circled the campsite, stopping now and then as if the thing making it was listening or thinking. I could hear the faint crunch of dirt under weight. Once, it came so close I could feel a small vibration in the soil beneath me. It stayed for what felt like hours, though it was probably minutes. When it finally drifted away, disappearing into the trees, I stayed frozen until the first thin line of morning light pushed through the tent fabric. When I stepped outside, I saw more marks. Not just one, but several. Long, thin, dragging lines circling the clearing, overlapping each other in strange looping patterns. Some were only a few inches long. Others stretched several feet before curving away. And near the fire pit, I found something that made my chest tighten so hard I couldn't breathe for several seconds. A piece of thick metal wire, bent at one end into a hook. It was old, rusted, covered in dirt, as if it had been sitting somewhere in the forest for years. But the end of it was clean, no rust, as if someone had scraped it against something during the night. That was enough for me. I packed camp in minutes, shoving everything into my backpack with shaking hands. I didn't eat. I didn't look around. I kept feeling like I was being watched. My skin prickled constantly, like eyes crawled across my back. The hike back to the car took twice as long as it should have because I kept stopping to listen. Every small sound made me freeze. I never saw anyone. I never saw anything. But once, while crossing a narrow stretch of trees, I found another dragging mark in the dirt that was fresh and cutting across the path at a strange angle, as if whoever left it had been following me but moved away the second I turned. By the time I reached my car, my legs were shaking. I threw my backpack into the back seat, got inside, and locked the doors before even starting the engine. When I drove down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. I didn't call anyone when I got home. I didn't tell anybody what I saw. I didn't have a good explanation, and saying it out loud felt like it would make it real in a way I didn't want. For months after, I couldn't sleep without hearing that slow movement circling the tent, those dragging lines in the dirt tracing careful, deliberate paths. I kept thinking about the wire hook left beside my fire pit, its clean end catching the light. The part that stays with me the most isn't the noise or the marks or even the open backpack. It's the thought that whoever was out there with me didn't want my gear, didn't want food, didn't even want to scare me. They were searching for something, and I still don't know if they found it. I still think about that night sometimes, even though it has been years. Back in 2016, when I was 24, I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Colorado. I had been working long shifts at a warehouse, barely seeing daylight most weeks, and I felt like I needed to reset my brain. I picked a place that wasn't very popular, a stretch of forest about 5 miles from an old fire lookout tower that had been closed since the early 2000s. I didn't care about the tower itself. I just wanted quiet, space, and air that didn't smell like oil or cardboard dust. I parked my car by a dirt road that was already half covered by fallen branches. I hiked in for about an hour until I found a clearing that looked open enough for a tent but still surrounded by trees thick enough to block the wind. The ground was soft and smelled like pine needles and cold soil. I set up everything slowly, taking my time because it felt good to move without rushing. The sun was still up, but the temperature kept dropping as the shadows grew longer. For most of that afternoon, nothing strange happened at all. I walked around the area, checked the nearby trees for signs of animals, and even climbed a small slope to get a better view of the sky. I cooked a simple meal on my little stove, ate it while sitting on a log, and listened to the steady sounds of the forest. It felt peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in years. I remember thinking I wished I had taken more trips like this earlier in my life. It wasn't until the sun started to sink behind the ridges that I felt something shift. The air went completely still. Usually there's at least a little movement in the branches or a few birds calling back and forth before dark. But everything dropped into this quiet that felt too heavy. I told myself it was normal. Sometimes evenings just get like that in high forests. But the stillness got under my skin, and I started double-checking my gear without really knowing why. By the time darkness wrapped around the clearing, the silence had turned into something that made my stomach tighten. I tried focusing on the small fire I had made, watching the flames jump in steady bursts. It helped a little, but every time a tiny twig snapped in the forest, I felt my pulse jump. I kept telling myself it was just animals, probably deer, maybe even a rabbit. But the sounds didn't match the usual random pattern of something wandering. They sounded slow, like something taking careful steps. A little after 10 p.m., I noticed it again. One loud crack deeper in the woods, like someone stepping on a thick branch. I froze. The fire popped behind me, and I felt the heat on my back, but my eyes stayed locked on the dark tree line. There was no movement, no glowing eyes, nothing. Just black shapes and the suggestion of branches against the sky. I tried to breathe normally. I tried to act like it was nothing. Then another sound came, this time from my left. A heavy footstep. Not fast, not running, just a single, slow step. My first thought was a bear, but I had camped in bear country before. Bears don't take slow steps like that unless they're stalking something, and even then their movement has a different rhythm. This felt more like something solid, like a person. But I knew there wasn't supposed to be anyone out there. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car or hiker on the way in. My heart started hammering harder than I could control. I grabbed my headlamp and switched it on. The beam cut across the trees, but the light only went so far before the darkness swallowed it. I kept scanning left to right, trying to catch anything, movement, color, a shape, anything. Nothing showed, but the feeling that something was there stayed strong, pressing against the back of my mind. I added more wood to the fire, partly so I could see better and partly because humans are stupidly comforted by flames. The shadows jumped wildly across the clearing, everything bending and shaking like the forest was breathing. I sat on the ground with my back to a tree so nothing could come up behind me without me knowing. Around midnight, the sounds stopped completely, every last bit of them. And as odd as it might sound, that silence scared me more. When something dangerous moves through the forest, animals usually react. When everything goes dead quiet, it means they're hiding. I didn't sleep at all. I kept my lamp close, listening, watching. The fire died down to glowing coals, and the cold started sinking through my jacket. Hours dragged on like wet rope, and I felt every minute of them. When the first gray light of dawn finally came, I felt like I had survived something I still didn't understand. I packed up my gear as fast as I ever had in my life. Before leaving, I walked a few feet past the edge of my camp toward the place where I had heard the first big crack. The ground was soft from old rain, and it didn't take long for me to see it. A footprint, not a boot print, a bare human footprint, deep, wide, and pressed hard into the soil like whoever made it was heavy or leaning their weight into each step. Pointed straight toward my campsite. A little farther, I found another, then another, all of them spaced apart like slow, deliberate movements. They stopped about 15 feet from where my tent had been. Whoever it was had stood there long enough to compress the ground in a shallow oval shape, like they had watched me for a while. After that point, the prints turned and headed back into the woods. I felt my chest tighten so hard it was almost painful. I didn't bother searching for more. I didn't want to know how long they had been out there. I didn't want to know if they had circled me during the night. I just grabbed my pack, tightened the straps, and walked fast in the direction of my car, trying not to look over my shoulder every other second. By the time I reached the dirt road, the sun was bright enough to warm the back of my neck, but the fear stayed with me. I didn't relax until I got inside my car and locked the doors. Even then, I kept checking the tree line as I drove away. I still have no idea who was out there that night. Maybe it was some stranger living off the grid. Maybe it was someone hiding out there for reasons I don't even want to think about. All I know is that they came close, too close, and they watched me long enough to make sure I never camped alone again. And I never have. I still remember the trip I took back in late autumn of 2019, when I was 24 and thought camping alone would help me clear my mind. I had been stressed for months, and the idea of being somewhere quiet felt like the only thing that could straighten out my thoughts. I picked a remote forest area in northern Idaho, near a lake I had only seen in photos. It looked peaceful, empty, untouched, exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning and reached the trailhead before noon. The air felt cold but clean, and the sky had that heavy gray look that meant rain could fall at any moment. I didn't care. I felt proud carrying my heavy backpack and walking deeper into the trees with each step. The path was narrow, and the fallen needles under my boots muted every sound. Even the wind felt quieter there. I kept moving until I reached a spot near the lake. Flat ground, a decent view, a good place to set up my tent. Everything felt normal at first. I unpacked slowly, wanting to enjoy the calm. The lake's surface barely moved. The trees looked still. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't feel unnatural but feels heavy, like the world is pausing for a second. I set up my tent, built a small fire ring with rocks, and made myself a simple meal. The cold air made everything taste better. For a while, I actually forgot why I came there in the first place. But the quiet slowly turned strange as evening crept in. The temperature dropped faster than I expected. The sky darkened earlier than it should have. I stood by the lake, watching a thin mist form on the surface. It wasn't thick or dramatic, just a faint layer, but something about it made me uneasy. It looked like it was hiding something beneath it. I tried to ignore the feeling. People camp alone all the time, I told myself. This is normal. As the light faded, I gathered more firewood. The ground felt soft under my boots, almost too soft, like the soil had been disturbed recently. I didn't think too hard about it until I stepped on a patch that sank more than the rest. I knelt down and touched the dirt. It was loose, dry on top but damp underneath, as if someone had dug there not too long ago. There were no tracks, no tools, nothing obvious, just a slightly sunken area. I brushed it off as an animal digging for food. When darkness finally took over, the whole forest fell silent. Not quiet, silent. No crickets, no birds, no wind through branches. The only sound was my fire crackling, and even that felt too loud. I tried to read a book I brought with me, but every few minutes, I found myself looking into the darkness around my campsite. My eyes kept catching shapes that turned out to be nothing, just shadows made by the fire behind me. Still, I felt watched, and the feeling got worse with every hour. Later that night, long after I had crawled into my sleeping bag, I heard footsteps somewhere beyond the trees. They were slow and deliberate, not like an animal running around, but like someone walking with care. The sound came from the same direction as that loose patch of soil. I held my breath and waited. It didn't stop. The steps went on for maybe a minute, then faded as if whoever or whatever it was moved deeper into the woods. I stayed still for a long time, my heartbeat loud in my ears. I kept telling myself that it was probably just a deer, maybe an elk, or something large enough to make footsteps that sounded human. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that the steps were too slow, too even. I eventually forced myself to sleep, but it didn't last long. A sharp sound woke me, something snapping, like a thick branch breaking under weight. I sat up straight in my tent, listening so hard that my head hurt. The sound came again, only this time it was closer. I felt cold sweat running down my back. I held on to the little pocket knife I kept near my sleeping bag, even though I knew it wouldn't do much if something went wrong. Minutes passed. Then I heard breathing, steady, controlled breathing, just outside my tent. Not an animal sniffing around. It sounded like a person trying not to make noise but failing. My stomach twisted. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there in the dark, trying to figure out what to do. The breathing continued for several seconds before it stopped. Then I heard slow footsteps again, moving away this time. I barely slept after that. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside and looked around. Nothing was broken or touched, but I noticed faint prints in the soil near the trees. They were long, narrow, shaped like boots. I followed them only a few feet before they disappeared into the harder ground. I didn't follow them any further. Something in my gut told me not to push my luck. I decided to pack up early. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt like something had been standing there all night, waiting for something. As I took down my tent, I looked again at the loose patch of soil I found the day before. With daylight, it looked even more disturbed. Someone had definitely dug there. I didn't want to know why. I left the campsite fast. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire hike back, half expecting to see someone following me. But nothing moved behind me. Nothing made a sound. The forest felt dead until I reached my car. Only then did the normal noise of wind and small animals return, almost like the woods had held its breath while I was inside it. When I finally reached the main road, the fear eased a little, but not completely. I drove home with the thought repeating in my head. Someone else had been out there with me. Maybe they had been watching me from the moment I arrived. Maybe they were the one who dug that hole. Maybe they were waiting for something I never found out. What scares me the most now is not what I heard, but what I didn't see. Whoever it was knew how to move quietly, how to stay hidden, how to walk right up to a tent without being noticed until the last second. I don't camp alone anymore. I haven't since that trip, and I don't think I ever will again. The forest wasn't haunted. It wasn't magical or cursed. It was just a place where someone else happened to be. Someone who didn't want to be found. And knowing that is more terrifying than any ghost story could ever be. I went camping alone in the late summer of 2019, in a quiet part of northern Colorado that I had never visited before. I had been stressed for months, and I wanted a break from noise and people. I picked a spot that was far from the main trails, close to an old fire road that almost no one used anymore. I was 30 at the time and felt confident enough in my outdoor skills to spend 2 nights by myself. I told a few people where I was going and gave them my return date, which made me feel a little safer. I reached the area late in the afternoon. The sky was clear, and the air felt dry and warm. The forest around me was a mix of tall pine trees and patches of open ground where the sun hit the dry grass. I found a flat area near a cluster of big boulders that looked like they had been there for centuries. I thought it was a perfect place for a tent. The ground was firm, and there were no signs of animals around, just a few old footprints from hikers that were probably weeks old. After setting up my tent, I walked a little ways into the trees to collect firewood. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest felt. Even the wind seemed to slow down. I could hear my own footsteps pressing into the dirt. The shadows looked long, even though it wasn't evening yet. When I turned back toward my tent, I had a strange moment where I couldn't see it right away, and a small panic went through my chest. But then I spotted the edge of the bright orange fabric peeking through the trees, and the fear faded. I shook it off and told myself I was just tired from the drive. I started a fire before sunset. The heat felt good as the air cooled quickly. I ate a simple meal and watched the sky turn darker and darker until the stars came out. It was peaceful, but there was heaviness to the silence that I couldn't ignore. My ears kept picking up small movements, dry grass bending, twigs shifting, faint rustles that I tried to blame on the wind. But the air had grown so still that even the flames made the only real sound. When it got late, I put out the fire and climbed into my tent. I zipped it up and lay on my back, listening. First, everything was normal. A few insects, the occasional distant crack from inside the forest. But around midnight, I woke up suddenly with my heart racing. I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep. For a moment, I just lay there in the dark, trying to calm myself. Then I heard it, a slow, heavy step somewhere outside the tent. The steps weren't fast or aggressive, but they were steady and deliberate, like someone walking with weight. The dirt outside made a soft crunch under every step. I held my breath and kept still. I reminded myself that animals wandered at night all the time, but something about the rhythm didn't feel right. It didn't match the light, quick movements of deer or smaller animals. It felt slower, more controlled. The steps came closer, then stopped, then moved again, circling. I could picture something just outside, studying the tent. I felt a tight pain in my chest as sweat collected on my forehead. I stayed awake for almost an hour until the steps faded into the distance. When I finally fell asleep again, it was only because my body was too exhausted to keep fighting the fear. The next morning, the ground around my tent had marks, but they weren't clear footprints. The dirt was dry and uneven, so I couldn't tell what had been there. I forced myself to stay calm. I convinced myself it was a large animal, maybe an elk or something heavy that passed through the area. Still, I decided to stay close to camp that day. I didn't want to wander far and come back to something waiting for me. The hours passed slowly. I kept noticing small things, branches that seemed out of place, subtle sounds from between the trees, the feeling of being watched whenever I looked away from the forest too long. By late afternoon, I felt drained and uneasy, but I still planned to finish the second night before heading home. I didn't want to leave early over something I couldn't explain. When the second night came, I made the fire larger and kept it burning longer. The warmth made me feel safer, and I hoped the light would keep anything away. I sat close to the flames until they burned down to glowing coals. I watched them pulse and fade. I stayed awake as long as I could, fighting the heavy pull of sleep. But eventually, my eyes closed, and I drifted off. I woke up again around 2 a.m., but this time, I didn't hear steps. I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing from just outside the tent wall, so close that I could feel the vibration of it through the thin fabric. It wasn't the sound of an animal sniffing or snorting. It sounded like a human trying to stay quiet. I froze completely. My mind felt numb, and every muscle in my body turned to stone. The breathing stayed there for several long seconds. Then it stopped, and everything went silent. That silence was worse than the sound. I waited for something to happen. Anything. I waited so long that my legs started to shake. When I finally found the courage to grab my flashlight, I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. I just lay there with my hand around it, feeling its cold metal body. A few minutes later, I heard movement, quick, light, but moving away. Not toward the forest, but toward the fire road. That detail shook me more than anything. Animals didn't walk toward man-made paths on purpose, but people did. I didn't wait until sunrise. I got out of the tent with my flashlight and packed only what I could reach quickly. The rest I left behind. I walked fast toward the road while checking between the trees every few seconds. The air felt sharp and still. The sky above me was full of stars, but the darkness around me felt endless. When I reached the fire road, I kept walking until the first sign of morning light touched the tops of the trees. Only then did the fear start to fade. When I finally reached my car, my hands were shaking so hard that I dropped the keys twice. I didn't look back at the forest when I drove away. I never went back to collect the things I left behind. In the days after, I tried to make sense of it. I told myself it could have been a very large animal, but the breathing had sounded too controlled, too steady, too human. And the way it moved toward the road instead of deeper into the forest stayed in my mind. I knew someone had been out there that night, moving slowly around my tent, watching me sleep, and I realized how lucky I was that they chose to leave instead of staying. I haven't camped alone since. Every time I think about doing it again, I remember that night, the steps in the dark, the breathing inches from my head, and the cold silence afterward. The forest didn't scare me. What scared me was knowing that another person had been out there with me, hidden in the dark, waiting for a reason only they knew. I decided to go camping alone in the early fall of 2021, just outside a small town in northern Montana. I was 27 at the time and felt like I needed a break from everything. I had been working long weeks at a warehouse job, barely sleeping, barely thinking about anything except what shift came next. The idea of being somewhere quiet, with no cars, no screens, and no noise, felt like the only thing I wanted. I picked a place near an old logging road that cut through a dense forest. It wasn't an official campground. It was just a wide open patch of dirt near a slow creek, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. I had found it on a hiking forum months back, and people wrote that it was peaceful, private, and usually empty. That made it perfect to me. I reached the spot in the late afternoon. The air was cool, and the smell of pine sap felt sharp and clean. There were no other cars on the road and no signs that anyone had camped there recently. The ground was covered in fallen needles, and the forest around me looked untouched, almost too quiet. I took it as a good sign at the time. I set up my tent facing the creek, laying out my sleeping bag, my small stove, and my food supplies. The sun dropped earlier than I expected, slipping behind the tall tree line and dimming the clearing fast. I collected firewood before it got too dark, tossing the dry pieces into a small pile. When the fire was going, the warmth felt like a shield against the cold air settling in. For the first 2 hours, nothing strange happened. I listened to the creek, the crack of the fire, and the occasional rustle of branches from small animals moving around. A rabbit hopped by once. A couple of birds argued somewhere far off. Everything felt normal, but sometime after the sky turned completely black, everything changed. The forest went silent. Not quiet, silent. No insects, no movement, no breeze pushing through the trees. The fire crackling was the only sound left, and even that seemed too loud. I tried to ignore the strange stillness, telling myself that maybe the temperature drop had pushed the animals deeper into the woods. But then I noticed something else. I felt watched. It was a slow, steady feeling that grew heavier each minute, like something was standing just out of the firelight, staring directly at me. I scanned the tree line again and again, but the darkness beyond the glow was too thick. I couldn't see more than a few feet past the light. The forest loomed like a giant black wall around me. My heartbeat felt too loud in my chest. The feeling didn't go away. It only tightened, like invisible weight pressing along my spine. I stopped tending the fire and just sat completely still for a long time, trying to hear anything. For almost 10 minutes, nothing changed. Then I heard it. A slow, heavy step on dry needles behind my tent. One step, then nothing. I sat up straighter. The sound hadn't been the shuffle of a small animal. It had weight, real weight. It sounded like the footstep of a grown man. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. I kept waiting for the next step, but none came. The fire felt too bright and too small. The darkness around me looked endless. After a while, I forced myself to pick up my flashlight. The metal felt cold in my hand. I clicked it on and aimed it toward the sound, sweeping the beam across the trees. All it showed were thick trunks, branches, and shadows. But the feeling of being watched grew sharper, almost like whoever or whatever was out there froze when the light passed over. I tried to convince myself it was a deer, maybe a big one. But deer don't move like that. They don't take one step and stop for minutes. They don't stay perfectly silent afterward. I didn't want to pack up in the dark, so I stayed near the fire the whole night, barely blinking. Every few minutes I heard something else. A light crunch of dirt, a soft shift of weight, a faint scrape like something brushing against a tree. Each sound came from a different spot, as if something circled me at a slow, measured pace. Never rushing, never fully approaching, but never leaving. At one point, I thought I saw movement between two trees, just a quick black shape sliding behind a trunk, but it was too fast and too far to identify. My skin felt cold, even with the fire heating the air around me. I lasted like that until the sky finally softened into pale gray. The moment sunlight touched the trees, the forest suddenly felt normal again. Birds chirped, small animals moved, the air warmed a little, and for the first time in hours, the feeling of being watched faded. I didn't waste a single second. I packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands shook so much I dropped things twice. When everything was stuffed into my backpack, I scanned the clearing one last time. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Not animal tracks, footprints. Human ones. Bare footprints. They were faint but clear enough in the soft dirt near the back of my tent. They led from the tree line toward my tent and then disappeared again into the woods. The size looked close to mine, maybe a bit wider. The toes pressed deep, like someone had been standing very still for a long time. I felt sick. The thought of someone walking around my campsite, barefoot, silent, watching me for hours, made my stomach twist. I didn't look any closer. I didn't want to know if there were more. I just grabbed my bag and got into my car. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror. The road was empty. The trees were still. But I couldn't shake the image of those footprints and the heavy, patient steps I heard in the dark. The worst part is that I never found any explanation. No missing person reports, no campers saying they saw a stranger in the woods. Nothing. It was like whoever was out there had no reason to be there except to watch. I haven't gone camping alone since that night, and I learned something very real and very simple. The scariest things in the woods aren't animals or monsters. They're people you never hear until they're already standing close enough to touch your tent. And some of them don't want to be seen. I chose a quiet stretch of forest in northern Idaho for a weekend camping trip in late September of 2021. I was 26, bored with my routine, and tired of screens and noise. I wanted a place where it felt like the world finally stopped moving. The trail I picked was far from the main highway and barely showed up on any map. I had checked the weather, packed everything I thought I might need, and told myself it would be a simple, calm trip. I didn't plan anything special. I just wanted silence. I parked my car at the end of a rough dirt road around noon, loaded my pack, and started walking. The air was cool and steady, and the trees had that dry, early fall smell that sits heavy in your nose. The path dipped up and down through thick pines, and the ground was covered with needles and soft dirt that made my footsteps almost disappear. I kept looking at my watch, counting the hours before sunset so I could set up camp before the cold came in. I reached a clearing about 3 hours later. It wasn't big, but it was flat, and a small creek ran just behind it. The closest town was nearly an hour away, and there were no other campers, no tire marks, no trash, nothing. Just the wind and the weak sound of water. It felt perfect, exactly what I thought I wanted. I set up my tent near the tree line, collected some fallen branches, and made a small fire pit. The light faded slower than I expected, stretching into a pale orange that washed across the trees. Everything felt normal until the sky finally turned dark. I was sitting by the fire, eating a simple meal, when I heard something crack deep in the woods. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to make me look up. I tried to brush it off. Animals roam everywhere out here, and I knew that. But after a few minutes, another sound came. This time it wasn't a crack. It was softer, like something brushing against thick undergrowth. The kind of sound made when something big moves very slowly. I kept still for a long time. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth against my legs, but my ears kept reaching for more noise. The forest grew heavier around me, like it was holding its breath. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A steady crunch of weight on the ground. Not running, not panicked. Slow, careful steps. I told myself it was a deer, maybe an elk, something harmless. The woods are full of them. But my body didn't believe that. The steps were steady and too heavy for anything graceful. They had weight like a person walking slowly. The fire started burning low, and the darkness behind the trees thickened. My stomach tightened, and I finally stood, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the tree line. The beam bounced between trunks and low branches, but there was nothing. No eyes reflecting the light, no figure stepping forward, just darkness swallowing everything it touched. The steps stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, though I knew it wasn't even 10 minutes. The air turned cold fast, the kind of cold that settles into your clothes. I fed the fire again, built it higher than before, and stayed awake longer than I planned. Even after I crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight in my hand and listened. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was still dark, but the fire outside had died. The forest was silent, too silent. Not even the creek behind the camp seemed to make noise anymore. I lay on my back, staring at the thin tent fabric above me, and that's when I heard it again. Something moving outside my camp. This time it wasn't walking. It sounded like something dragging across the ground, slow and rough. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a moment. The sound circled the tent at a distance, then stopped near the front entrance. I felt the pressure of footsteps right outside, like the dirt shifted under a heavy weight. There was no talking, no breathing sounds, just stillness. I waited until my muscles ached from tension. Eventually the steps moved away, fading back into the trees. I didn't sleep again. I stayed there, stiff and half-frozen, waiting for dawn. When the first weak light hit the tent, I unzipped it slowly and stepped out. The ground around the tent had fresh marks, but not animal prints. They looked like boot tracks. Someone had walked around my camp during the night. Someone large with deep, slow steps. One track was so close to the entrance that I couldn't believe I hadn't heard the fabric move. I packed my things fast, faster than I ever had before. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there and reach the trailhead before whoever had walked around my tent came back. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every sound made me turn my head. Every shadow between the trees looked deeper than it should. On the hike back, I found something I hadn't noticed on the way in. A crushed plastic bottle lying near the path, old but not too old. A few steps later, I saw part of a torn tarp caught on a branch. Then a cigarette but half buried in the dirt. None of these things had been there the previous day. I was sure of that. Someone else had come through the area after I set up camp. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack inside and locked the doors before even catching my breath. The road out felt longer than it should have, like the forest was trying to hold on to me one last time. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. Only then did I feel some of the tension drain from my body. I knew exactly what had happened, even if I tried to push the thought down. Someone had been living out there or hiding out there, watching the woods, watching campers who came too close. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone avoiding people, maybe someone with worse intentions. I'd never know, but I knew it wasn't an animal. The tracks were human. I haven't gone camping alone since that weekend. I still enjoy the outdoors, but I stick to places where other people are nearby, where I can hear voices or see a car in the distance. The woods in northern Idaho are still beautiful, but now when I think of them, I don't think about peace or silence. I think about heavy steps circling my tent and the cold feeling of knowing someone stood just inches away from me while I slept, in the dark, without saying a word. And that is enough to keep me away. I was 26 the year it happened, and I still think about it when I pack my camping gear. I had taken a long weekend off from work and wanted to spend some time alone in the woods. I chose a remote state forest in northern Montana, far from towns and noise, a place where the air felt colder and cleaner, and where the tall pines made everything look older than it was. It was late September of 2019, so the nights were already cold but not freezing yet, and the days were clear enough to make you forget the season was changing. I parked my truck on a dirt road that hardly anyone used. The ground was covered with dry needles, and every step made a soft crunch under my boots. I carried my backpack, tent, food, and a small metal box with emergency items. I walked for nearly 40 minutes before finding a spot that looked perfect. A small clearing opened between a cluster of pines, and a shallow stream ran a little downhill from it. The area felt untouched, almost too quiet, like the kind of place where you start hearing your own heartbeat after standing still for a few seconds. I set up my tent close to the edge of the clearing. The air was crisp, and the light moved through the trees in long lines that shifted every minute. I built a small fire using fallen branches, and the smoke curled up into the sky in thin gray strips. When I looked around, I realized I hadn't seen a single person since I left the road. I liked that at first. That silence was the reason I came. The first afternoon passed calmly. I walked around, took a few photos, and explored the area. I found old deer tracks by the stream and a few claw marks on a fallen log, probably from a black bear months ago. Nothing fresh. Everything about the place felt peaceful. By the time the sun dipped behind the tree line, the temperature fell fast. The woods changed color, turning dark blue, then nearly black. The fire carried most of the warmth, and I stayed close to it, watching the sparks drift upward like tiny fireflies. Later that night, after I crawled into my tent, the forest felt heavier than before. The cold air made the fabric of the tent feel thin, and every sound outside seemed sharper. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. At one point, I heard what sounded like something moving through dry leaves. Not fast, slow, steady steps. I assumed it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I didn't think too much about it and eventually fell asleep again. In the morning, the frost around the clearing made everything look white. My tent was damp on the outside, and the grass felt stiff when I stepped on it. As I walked around stretching my legs, I noticed something odd in the dirt a few feet from my tent. There were footprints. Not animal tracks, actual footprints. Human ones. They were larger than mine, maybe belonging to a man with heavy boots. The tracks circled the tent once, then stopped on the side facing the stream. It looked like whoever made them had stood there for a while before walking back into the trees. For a few minutes, I just stared at them. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe it was a hiker passing by. Maybe someone was camping nearby and had wandered over in the night. But the prints looked fresh, and I hadn't heard voices or seen signs of anyone earlier. The dirt was soft enough that whoever made the prints had been very close enough to touch the tent if they wanted. That thought stayed with me as I ate breakfast. I felt watched even though I couldn't see anyone. I considered packing up and leaving, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to ruin the trip over something that might have a simple explanation. I stayed. I hiked deeper into the forest during the day, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The wind was light, and a few birds moved through the branches, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. At one point, I saw a tree with its bark peeled off in long strips, but it looked like an old scar, nothing recent. When I returned to camp late in the day, the sun was already low. The firewood I had left stacked beside the pit looked slightly disturbed, like someone had shifted it. Maybe an animal had nosed around, I told myself, even though it didn't match how animals usually move things. I tried to shake it off as my imagination building on the morning's discovery. That night was worse. The air felt colder, and my breath kept fogging inside the tent. I lay still for a long time, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again. They were soft, careful, almost like someone was trying not to make noise. The steps stopped right outside my tent, close enough for me to sense a presence even without hearing breathing or movement. My chest tightened, and my hands shook inside my sleeping bag. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just stayed still and waited. After several long minutes, the steps moved away. They were slow, almost dragging, and then eventually faded into the woods. I stayed awake until the sky started turning gray. When I got out of the tent, more footprints covered the area around it. Fresh ones, clearer than yesterday. They circled twice this time, stopping near the back of the tent, as if the person had crouched or leaned close. The ground showed a deeper indentation where they had stood longer. Something about the sight made my skin feel tight. I packed my things fast. I didn't cook. I didn't sit down. I kept looking over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see someone watching from between the trees. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, but tense, like the woods were holding their breath. When I finally reached my truck and locked the doors, I felt a wave of relief so strong it made my legs weak. I drove away faster than I should have, the road shaking the truck as I hit every bump too hard. Only when I reached the highway did I slow down. I never reported it. There was nothing specific to report. No face, no name, no proof except footprints and a feeling I couldn't quite explain. But the ending is simple and clear. Someone was out there with me those nights. Someone who came close to my tent while I slept. Someone who stood there long enough to leave deep prints in the dirt. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they had other plans. I don't know, and I don't want to know. I haven't camped alone since. I never planned to camp alone that summer, but everything fell into place in a way that pushed me toward it. I had some vacation days saved up, my friends were busy, and I felt a strange craving to be somewhere quiet. I was 28 at the time, tired from months of work, and the idea of being far from people sounded comforting. I picked a place in northern Montana, not too far from the Canadian border, a place with long stretches of forest and narrow dirt roads that rarely saw cars. I wanted something peaceful, and that area looked empty enough for that. I left early in the morning, around 6, driving an old silver sedan that rattled every time I hit a bump. By noon, I reached a gravel road that my map said led to a small lake. The air smelled of pine and dry dirt, and I could hear nothing except insects and the low humming of the wind. I parked near a clearing where the ground was uneven and covered with old tire tracks. It looked like hunters might have used it sometime in the past, but no one was there now, and the silence made it feel like I had stepped into a place time had forgotten. I set up my tent near some tall spruce trees. The ground was hard but manageable. I placed my sleeping bag inside, unpacked my cooler, and arranged everything neatly as if I had something to prove. I liked the order of it. It felt like I was building a tiny version of home in the middle of nowhere. The lake was about 5 minutes down a small slope, and the water was clear enough to see stones at the bottom. I walked around the area for a while, testing the ground, looking at the trees, trying to understand what kind of animals lived here. I found tracks that looked like deer, maybe moose. Nothing unusual. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped a little, and the forest took on a cooler, darker tone. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and watched the smoke rise in a slow spiral between the trees. There was something calming about the isolation. It made my thoughts clearer and heavier at the same time. I kept telling myself I needed this, that the silence would help me reset. Night came faster than I expected. The trees blocked most of the sunset, so it almost felt like someone had flipped a switch. I sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the crackling of the wood. After a while, I grew tired and climbed into the tent. I zipped the door shut, lay down, and listened to the forest. The sounds were normal at first. Crickets, something shifting through the leaves from time to time, maybe a small animal. Felt natural. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I did not know why at first. My heart was beating fast, but there was no clear reason for it. Then I heard something. Leaves crunching. Slow, heavy steps. Not the soft, fast sound of a deer. More like something dragging its weight carefully, trying not to make noise. The sound moved past my tent and stopped. I could not see anything in the darkness, and the thin walls of the tent made me feel almost exposed. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a large one. But the steps did not continue. They didn't retreat either. They stopped too close. I stayed awake for nearly an hour, barely breathing. When I finally fell back to sleep, it was only because my body forced me to. I woke up early with the sun, sweating inside the tent. I went outside and looked around. The ground near my tent had fresh marks, deep ones, as if someone had stepped hard enough to break the soil. The prints didn't look like boots, but they also didn't look like animal tracks. They were messy, uneven, as if someone walked with a limp or carried something heavy. The air felt different that morning, heavier, tense in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to brush it off, but it stayed with me. I walked to the lake, splashed my face with freezing water, and tried to think. I wondered if maybe someone had been walking around at night. A hunter, maybe. But there were no cars, no signs of anyone else camping, and the nearest town was more than an hour away. I tried to convince myself it was nothing serious. The rest of the day passed quietly. I hiked a bit farther into the woods, took pictures, and tried to distract myself. But every now and then, I felt the sense of being observed. It was subtle, like an itch in the back of the mind. At one point, I thought I saw something between the trees, movement, like a figure stepping behind a trunk. But when I stared, there was nothing. By evening, I felt uneasy enough to consider leaving the next morning. I didn't want to pack up in the dark, so I told myself I'd stay one more night and head out early. I made another fire as the sun lowered, focusing on the flames to distract myself. When darkness returned, it felt even deeper than the night before, as if the trees had grown thicker and closer. I got into my tent earlier than usual, not feeling relaxed anymore. My ears stayed sharp, waiting. For almost an hour, nothing happened. I let myself hope the previous night had been a random animal. Then it started again. Soft steps at first, coming from farther away. Then slower, closer, deliberate. I felt my breath catch in my throat as the footsteps reached the edge of my campsite. I could hear the weight shifting, like someone leaning, then standing still. A long pause followed. My skin prickled. I felt the kind of fear that makes your body freeze. The kind that strips away logic. The steps circled my tent once, then twice. They stopped behind me, where the fabric was closest to my head. I could hear breathing, faint but steady. Human. I stayed absolutely still, barely blinking, waiting for something to happen. Minutes felt like hours. Then the breathing faded. The steps retreated, crunching farther and farther until they were gone. I didn't sleep again after that. When the sky finally started turning pale, I got out of the tent and looked around. I don't know why I expected to find nothing, but I didn't. The ground behind the tent had an imprint, deep and clear, a footprint. Not animal, human, barefoot. The toes had dug into the soil like someone had leaned in close. There were more prints leading back into the trees, staggered and uneven. My stomach dropped. My hands shook. I packed my things as fast as I could, barely thinking. I threw everything into the car without caring about order. The whole time I felt like someone was standing just beyond sight, watching. I kept turning around, expecting to see movement, but the forest stayed still. When I finally drove away, the road felt too narrow and too long. I kept checking my rearview mirror, terrified I would see someone step out of the trees behind me. I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway. I never went back to that area again. For weeks afterward, I woke up at night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. I knew it was in my head, but the memory stayed sharp. Someone had been out there in the middle of the night, circling my tent, standing inches from me while I slept. Someone who did not speak, did not show themselves, did not run away when noticed. Someone barefoot, wandering deep in the woods far from any town. And the scariest part was realizing that if I hadn't woken up both nights, if I had slept deeply enough, if I hadn't left at first light, I might never have known someone was there at all. I might not have left at all.